Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of Viva Broadcast's Innovation Through Improvisation. On this episode, resident faculty Dr. Derek Ganong and Dr. Timothy Shade are joined by Gina Izzo of Bespoken and RighteousGIRLS to discuss how each came to learn improv. They go on to talk about the challenges they faced when they started, why they got into improv, where it led them in their careers, and how it opened the door for innovation and collaboration. If you're looking for a reason to tackle improvising, this episode's definitely for you.
So hello everybody, my name is Derek Ganong and I'm one of the trumpet faculty for the Brass Institutes of Virginia. I'm wearing my snazzy Fred Brass shirt here today, and this is our 21st, I believe, episode of Viva Broadcasts. And today I'm joined by Dr. Tim Shade, who is the Director of Bands at Wichita State and also is one of our faculty and conductor and composer and arranger and joke teller at the Brass Institutes of Virginia. And I'm also joined by a good friend, Gina Izzo, and she's a co-founder of Bespoke, and she plays flute with the RighteousGIRLS. And I went to Interlochen the year after she left, and we went to NYU together, and Gina's awesome. I've had her out here to do entrepreneurial related stuff and new music related stuff at Boise State University. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the two of you here, and we're gonna jump right into it. When we were brainstorming topics for these Viva broadcasts, I said, hey, too much of this is about just playing classical music and going doot, 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 and that's really great. But, I found a lot of coming at this music. The way I came at this music was through jazz, and so I'm kind of like a jazz guy who learned how to play classical music, whereas a lot of other people, we're all going to share our perspectives on this, but there's a bunch of different ways we can kind of access this, and I found improvisation and jazz and that way of thinking as something that really helped maximize what I was able to do with regular performance music, and have kind of integrated those two things together, and there was kind of a tug of war. So we're just going to start and go around, and we'll start with Gina, and I'd like you to just talk to us a little bit about your background and how you came into improvising and having improvisation be a part of your life.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much, Derek, for having me join you. So my entry point, my background in music is in classical. I had studied classical my entire life. Both my mom and my father were classical musicians. My dad also performed jazz, and growing up I studied classical with them. It was a very steady part of our household routines of taking lessons, and my sister was also a classical clarinetist. So over the years, I really saw myself from a very early age, probably around 5th grade. I said, I am going to become a classical orchestral flutist when I grow up. And in my high school years, Derek had mentioned, I had become familiar with the Interlochen Arts Academy through a friend of mine in Buffalo who was a classical oboist. And so I ended up going there for 2 years and found myself wanting to pursue a degree in classical performance. So I ended up in New York City at Manhattan School of Music, and then at NYU, both in performance for flute. It wasn't until my master's, so this must have been 2010, when I joined and began a duo called RighteousGIRLS with one of my very good friends, Erica Dowie, who's a pianist. And we started off with all the repertoire that was made available to us at the time, which was primarily flute, piano pieces, traditional Bach or Mozart classical works that we could perform, and music that was just readily available to us. So we started with that repertoire, and I think I found my way, and maybe I should say we found our way into improvising as a duo by mistake, because we were performing a piece, and in the middle of the piece, my sheet music flew off my stand. And I panicked, and my duo partner kept going, and then she started vamping. She had no idea if she should continue, and she had no idea if she should stop. We were at this moment where neither one of us knew what to do. We didn't know which place we were in the music anymore, and she was just jamming on this groove. And so we had to do something, and I started just playing around with notes, and in the key of which the piece was in, and we finally landed at a certain pivotal point in the music where we got back on the train and we finished the piece. So I will say that was probably my first performance really on stage where we were completely improvising in every single aspect possible. With my duo, Righteous Girls, we both had a really strong love for listening to jazz, and so we together would go to a lot of the downtown New York music scene venues to check out artists. Pretty much every night for years we would go to jazz clubs, and what I found was the people I wanted to play with and what I was trained to do as a classical musician were not necessarily aligned with each other. So I think with the duo, we began pursuing more contemporary composers and trying to integrate kind of open improvised sections in very, very, very small forms within the music as a starting point for us to begin to develop our own languages, improvisers individually and together. So I think I would say that improvising for me was kind of found by mistake in my love for jazz at the same time.
So it was like an accident, and then you're like, wait a minute, I can do this, and that means I can play with these cool people who I see all the time in New York City.
A little bit.
That's
a great
awesome.
story.
Well,
Holy
Tim, tell us the trombone story.
Oh yeah, so like I came up classical euphoniumist, and like if you don't know what a euphonium is, good, neither do I. You know what I mean? Like, what is that? And so we really only lived in concert bands at that point, and got to high school, was really curious about jazz, and naturally the euphonium is a valved instrument, so they threw a valve trombone at me, and I think we were playing like 1 o'clock jump, really standard big band tune that had a bunch of slides in it, glisses, and it was like I couldn't do that. And so my uncle was a trombone player, and so I just picked up slide trombone and tried to learn how to do it. And it was literally like, I want to say 3 weeks after I did that, same tune, 1 o'clock jump, the director said, well, who wants to take a solo on this? And we had written out solos that were already in the parts, which is that way sort of with young jazz ensemble literature. And so I sort of played it, and I didn't understand what these letters and numbers were and was really confused, but I really wanted to swing so badly. And that was sort of the start of it. And then he said, well, we're going to give you 2 choruses. I didn't even know what a chorus was, but he goes, just repeat that section and do what you want the second time. I mean, it was like trial by fire, same kind of thing, just go. In rehearsal, at least. It wasn't on a concert. I would have lost my mind if it had happened to me on a concert. And that's sort of where it started. I got lucky in Columbus, Ohio, where I grew up. There was a wonderful youth jazz program. Actually, Todd Stoll, who's the director of education at Jazz at Lincoln Center, was the big band director in Columbus. And so I kind of sort of aspired to be in that band and got hooked up with him. And that's when he started sort of talking to me about some theory things, started taking some lessons and learning more about the theory behind it. But I would say that it really didn't take off until much later. But it started sort of organically, I guess, how I've heard sort of a lot of young improvisers. I've got lucky, you thrust into a big band, here's a solo, go. That's kind of how improvising started with me. It was funny though, because I mean, we're talking about being a classical musician and then getting jazz. That sort of started to inform how my euphonium playing went down. And then all of the classical stuff that I had on euphonium informed how I would improvise. And so throughout my schooling, both undergrad and master's degree especially, I kept playing euphonium and jazz trombone sort of simultaneously. Led to arrangings, led to all kinds of stuff. So improvisation is a much bigger word than jazz soloing, just kind of like Gina was talking about. It's a much different concept. So that's kind of how I got started. Similar, but not as scary.
Yeah, Tim, I think you're so right in that, improvisation is more, when we say improvisation, we always think jazz. And while, that may have been sort of the roots of that might be our Bach, as it were, there's so much more meaning behind improvisation than just doing like in the jazz sense. And just, really quickly to share my perspective of it is I grew up a typical trumpet player, and I wanted to play high. And so I played in jazz band and pretty quickly practiced myself into being able to play lead. And so I was kind of like the bull in the china shop for a very long time. And I grew up listening to, actually, my wife makes fun of me all the time because I don't know anything that's on the radio. Or I don't even know anything that was on the radio in the last 30 years or more, just because, I didn't listen to any of that stuff. And I was listening to Maynard Ferguson and Arturo Sandoval and Clifford Brown and Freddie Hubbard and all these, all of this stuff. And, I think I listened to everything that Art Blakey ever did and all this stuff. And so that was in my ear. And so I really, when I got to Interlochen, the jazz teacher there, Bill Sears, he was, in the improvisation class that I got a C in, he was like, Derek really knows what jazz is supposed to sound like, but really has no clue why. And so like that was kind of my beginning. And then I went through an embouchure change because I couldn't play trumpet very well, and I was just, all that stuff. And my trumpet teacher was like, well, if you want to get into college, you can either wait a year and rebuild your chops or learn how to improvise. And so that's how I got into college, was I learned how to improvise that way. And it was a very painful process going through it. And then, at the end of my undergraduate career, I was like, I like, they said, what do you want to play? Orchestra, jazz band? I was like, I just want to play trumpet. And so I was, learning how deficient I was and how far behind I was with all the classical stuff that we needed to be able to do to play in a refined way. And kind of spent the rest of my master's degree and doctorate learning how to go tuku, and it took a long time to connect the jazz aspect and the classical aspect, and it was sort of like I would sound natural playing jazz, and then I would play classical music, and it would be forced. And they would be like, "Why can't you play?" I remember, one day Laurie Frank was like, "Why can't you play the Ionescu the same way you play Clifford Brown's solo on Joy Spring?" And so I've been kind of trying to come to terms with that. And so I think it's really interesting. And I love the idea of improvisation. I think, the jazz thinking allows us to hear things in more than one way, even as they're written down. And, as opposed to just being like, that's the way it's supposed to be because that's how it's written. And it kind of makes us a little bit more flexible, and we can adapt and learn about aesthetic on the fly too. So improvisation, we all kind of, learned starting at different levels and points, and, some of us knew what it sounded like, but didn't know what it was. And some of us knew what it was, but didn't know what it sounded like. But improvisation is one of these lifelong processes. And, whenever beginners start improvising, we've probably all had this experience, that there's a bunch of frustrations right at the very beginning. And oftentimes they keep people from wanting to improvise. So, let's talk a little bit about what some of those frustrations were for you. Gina, why don't you take the lead here?
Sure. I think one of the biggest frustrations for me beginning improvising was the fear of making a mistake. And I think that is one, rooted because I had been around and was familiar with and listening to such incredible improvising jazz, just improvising artists in general, that it always seemed like they knew exactly what they wanted to do, when they wanted to do it, what their intentions were with it. And I was starting off and I was like, I don't know if what I'm saying is correct. And I think that was one of the biggest barriers that I had to and still have to let go of sometimes, especially when I'm working with artists I haven't worked with before. So I mentioned my duo Righteous Girls, and I think that's a really good example that we both started at a very similar place, both having a classical background. So as we were developing our repertoire, which was dominantly composed music, which might have begun incorporating improvising, that neither one of us necessarily knew if what we were doing was correct, but all we knew is that we were developing it together. And that was extremely helpful, I think, for both of us to kind of use that. I want to say it was kind of a safety for both of us, because we knew that we were having our own conversation and kind of began the beginning steps of developing our own individual vocabularies. And so I think, the fear of making a mistake, and also just it's almost like reading a foreign language, looking at the music of someone who is writing for improvising. Some of it looks like a roadmap, and some of it has, as you mentioned before, Timothy, that you see numbers and symbols, and I had never studied what any of those mean. So I was given music, and it was like it was reading another language for me. And so I think feeling comfortable saying, okay, I don't know exactly what's here, but I do have the ability to play my instrument and I can use my ears. And to begin to chime into those conversations, maybe at a slower rate than like taking a full out solo, I think were both things that helped me begin feeling more comfortable. And I think the level of comfort is what generally stops people from trying it in the first place.
Yeah, I think that there also like there's this idea of drinking from a straw or drinking from a fire hose. And I think that beginning improvisers especially, I know that I sort of recall it, there was too much freedom once I started to understand the capabilities. We're used to looking at black notes. That's what we learn how to play. And all of a sudden you have slash marks, which means you can play any rhythm, you can play any note basically. And so that, I think it sort of is in sort of in line with what Gina was saying. It's like, what do I do with all this? How do I go forward? And so for me, I just wanted to play the right notes. I mean, that's what it was really about, because how do I know what notes are the right notes? And so what's so frustrating, I think, I taught a jazz theory class actually a few years ago, and it was so interesting because it was classical musicians in this jazz theory class. We have sort of a weird track at WSU that would allow you to take that instead of theory 3. So their background was basically in major scales and sort of some basic diatonic harmony. When we started to go into more advanced harmonic structures, it was very interesting that they just completely, it blew their minds, like not in a good way either. They were just like, I don't understand. How does a dominant chord work? And so I find that when I was younger, looking at sort of harmony, which is what I learned to study, everybody sort of goes for triads or, the spelling of the chords, and they go from there. Or we learn sort of a horizontal way of improvising, which is like, over the B flat blues, you can play the blues scale, and so what's that?
Don't say it.
I know, right? I loved my high school band director, but that's what he did to us. And so it's still the same thing of, I want to play the right notes. How do I learn to play the right notes? And I think that's a tough barrier for people to get over with. I mean, it took me forever before I felt comfortable playing a chorus of anything and felt like I was going to play right notes at least, and I think that the other thing that I also noticed with young improvisers, and I had a similar problem, was rhythmic schemes. So when it's sort of funny, we first start to talk, you just try and say words, just a word, just dad or mama. Yet when we go to improvise, most of us have been playing our instruments for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, and we want to make paragraphs, but we can't even use words. And so I never was taught how to improvise in a jazz idiom, at least, like a lot of other people, where here, learn this 2-bar phrase, which goes along with these chord changes, and now learn that in all 12 keys, which when you think about it is scary as all get out, but actually that's learning a word and learning how to say it many different ways. And I think that's a tough hurdle for everybody, because they get this idea of, I have to learn one lick in 12 keys. I can't play in the key of B. What's B?
It's a trombone, right?
Those are the two big things for me, is getting over what notes are the right notes that I can play. So when I've had the ability to sort of work with people, it's like, you got to live in the dissonance a little bit, like be okay playing wrong notes, learn how to resolve them to the right notes, and then being able to sort of string together some words, both in a rhythmic schema and a harmonic vocabulary. I still fight with that, man. If I don't play a solo for a while or improvise, I got to go back to the basics a little bit and like really build back up my vocabulary, because it just kind of disappears in a bebop or jazz, which bebop is it's kind of our traditional jazz idiom anymore. So I don't get to improvise necessarily in a classical sense. I couldn't do the Bach or mordents and things like that. And I have a colleague that does it a lot. She's a flutist actually as well. And so it's just so interesting to all those goofy hurdles, and there's several different ways of doing it. So, but yeah, harmony and words were always my biggest challenges.
Yeah, that resonates with me a lot too. I think, again, I'm coming at it from an obtuse angle, because I didn't care about sounding bad. or about playing the wrong notes, which is probably why I very rarely got asked to play a solo, looking back now. But it was like, for me, it was aural satisfaction, and it was sort of like I knew what it should sound like. Looking back, I was very well learned as far as listening to music and knowing what it was supposed to sound like. I couldn't tell you what Michael Jackson sounded like, but I knew what Freddie Hubbard sounded like. And so for me, it was sort of like, did what I play meet my expectations? No. Damn it. Did what I play meet my expectations? No. Damn it. And I didn't really know how to get there. And it wasn't until, I got that C in improvisation class at Interlochen from Bill Sears that he finally gave me the tools to start that. And it was like, once I figured out how to play, I remember he was like, here's a 2-bar phrase. It goes over 2-5-1 and it passes through the flat 9. Learn this in all 12 keys. And I got a C trying to do that, and an embouchure change, granted, but I was a stupid trumpet player. And once I really got that under my belt, which was granted 2 or 3 years after that class, then my ear was sort of like, yeah, that's what it was supposed to sound like. Yeah, that's what it was supposed to sound like. And then once I kind of had that aural feedback that's like, yes, I can sound good, and I have some things that are reflexive I can do that do sound good, it kind of opened the doors for me to go a little bit further. And so, now I want to kind of orient us, now we're kind of familiar improvising. We've gotten past like that monumental amount of work where you start to say, okay, I can do this in any, skill field. So, now what kinds of frustrations are we facing? And we could just go in a circle, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are things that are always going to continue to be challenges. I think something that once I began improvising more and I had begun the steps of kind of developing, Tim, you had mentioned kind of just not having full paragraphs formed yet. Yeah. So really starting off developing words. And I think it's like one word at a time before I could build into making a sentence in an improvised setting. And the sentence, it's like then you have to learn to build one sentence and 2 sentences, and maybe you finally get to a full paragraph. But I think that being able to develop those words on your own and begin to form those sentences it's great. And once you get to that point, I think the challenge really becomes the fact that the people in the music that you are improvising with or to is constantly changing. So you might be in one setting where you've developed a language that you feel works in that setting, and all of a sudden you're asked to improvise in a completely different setting. So if I'm working with my contemporary duo, that's one thing because we've built up our own language, but then you get asked by another artist who might be a singer-songwriter or whose background might be more rooted in jazz or in indie rock. And so then you're asked to improvise in their context. And so you're having to constantly respond and to listen to what it is that they're doing. And I think that remains kind of the next tier of challenges is once you feel more comfortable in an improvised setting, then how do you build up the comfort in many different types of those settings with many different types of music?
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I mean, going from playing in a jazz quartet setup where you're the only horn, and then going to play in a big band, soloing can be different in that instance. And then going and play in a free jazz session, which is kind of that was kind of my background. I was always in jazz. There wasn't always a lot of performance art where you were improvising. I knew a lot of people that did that, but they never asked me to do it. I probably was too square for that. I probably played too much harmony or something. So I found, it was funny, both Gina and Derek, you have talked about listening as being your primary sort of start where you were listening. That came to me second, where I actually was learning the building blocks of everything, and then was finding trombone players to emulate. And like, could I sound like Conrad Herwig? Could I sound like J.J. Jackson or J.J. Johnson? Sorry, Jackson. I don't know who that is. Yeah,
Michael
right.
Jackson, right. Yeah,
Michael Jackson and J.J. Johnson. And I think that was, it's sort of the idea of a performance practice, which is this weird thing, right? Like, and it's a taboo thing for us even to think about in the classical realm, is that you don't really want to sound like anybody else. But if I don't know how to sound like them, how can I sound like myself? And so that was the next hurdle after I sort of had a tiny grasp of harmony was, could I play these tunes? Could I play these tunes and sound like this person? And then the next one, which I'm still working on, I'm sure we all are, is like how to just be as emotional as you could be playing a phrase that you think about a million different times, and then finally you find your way of doing it. How can you do that while you're improvising with no written notes? So to create an arc, a musical arc inside of a solo that actually is completely open-ended. So is it, if it's a 32 bar song form, are you only going to do 32 bars to do that? Or are you going to do it in 4 choruses? And that was always the challenge for me, is how to build that idea of a solo. So that was definitely the middle to now forever. I mean, I'm constantly thinking about that. What is where is my, how does it work? And I say solo like it's all about me, but where's this moment where I'm improvising? What's the purpose of the improvisation? How do we make it fit into the larger framework? And that was always my, I still work on that. I mean, we just did a goofy little project on Blue Shades that Frank DeKelly approved. And I think I must have done 25 takes of like 5 bars. I mean, it was just, it was nothing there really, but like to get the emotion to what I think that the arranger wanted, who was Dakota Corliss, to get that sort of what he wanted, I was like, man, it's still not there. It's not right. Or I'd clam a note because there were no real chord changes. And it's like, you just have to work with it. And finally, when I felt comfortable enough, there were a couple of really cool takes. And I was like, oh, I'm starting to get it now. So we actually study improvising just like we would, playing a Bach cello suite, which I played a bunch. So I think that's kind of how I've always been, or what I've always been working on, is how to make it emotional after I understand what I'm doing.
I love that. I was in my DMA was my home base for my doctorate was jazz at University of Miami. And so it was like the big issue that I always would have run into was, was like, like Gina and Tim were talking about, I was always trying to search for my own voice or search for a way to go beyond like beyond what I had learned how to digitally, reproduce. But in like a college setting, a conservatory setting, and this is probably true in the jazz world too, is that, jazz musicians are incredible connoisseurs of their original art form. And so like, if you play your ornaments incorrectly for Bach, the Bach people will eat you alive. And so that was kind of the same way, and in a sense, bebop or jazz is kind of a period music in and of itself. Right. And so at the University of Miami, it was sort of like, I could go back and go into like book mode and like play the right things on the right chords, play the right notes. And they'd be like, okay. And I would find that, people would call me for stuff and I would get solos. And then as soon as I would start to venture off and like go off the deep end, as many of my friends called it, then they'd be like, that was the weirdest thing I've ever heard. And then I wouldn't get a solo the next time. And so it was sort of like the conservatory setting was trying to preserve this idea of bebop as the ideal. And of course there were plenty of teachers and students and things like that who saw that and respected that. But I think it's kind of like the inertia of jazz as it is, in a lot of senses. And so I think this makes a really good segue into the next thing I want to talk about, which is sort of like post jazz. And it's like I call so someone who has studied what we've studied in order to improvise and then moved past that, I call those kinds of people informed improvisers, in that their improvisation is informed by study. Whereas there's a lot of improvisers out there who have accessed creative playing without having to study the beginning. And so that would sort of be like, a classical musician not playing anything before 1920 and then being a performer of their art form. They haven't really, they can still be very good, but they're not going to be as informed. And so, there's certainly a lot of settings that all three of us have probably found ourselves in, where we're working with people who are not necessarily informed improvisers, but are still very good improvisers. And so, let's just talk a little bit kind of about, the intersection of those two things and how we feel like, the perception of improvisation, or I guess a better way of putting it is the perception of the jazz community by those who are accomplished musicians outside of it. Boom.
Processing that.
Yeah, I know.
In a little bit. So I guess we're looking at how these kind of worlds collide in a way. So if someone, for example, who is rooted in jazz is collaborating with someone who's rooted in classical, how are they creating their dialogue? Is that kind of what we're looking at right now?
Sure. And just, just kind of like the perceptions. I'm in the jazz world looking to classical, and you're kind of
Yeah.
in the classical world looking to jazz. How do we see each other?
It's interesting because, so I mentioned there was a certain time in my life, probably about 2010 to 2014 or 15, where I was living in the West Village in Manhattan, and I had access to every single jazz club and some of the best jazz clubs in the world to check out artists. And I would go pretty much almost every night to just listen to artists. And it was interesting because the ones that I felt um, the ones I felt their music had resonated the most with me were the ones who were the most curious about the classical music world and had a really, really, really strong interest in learning more and forming collaborations with classical artists to kind of find a way to meet in the middle, and try to form a dialogue between these two practices. So for example, a couple artists that I I really loved going to their shows. One was Ambrose Akinmusire, a really incredible trumpeter and composer, and whose music tends to remain pretty abstract. And the music that I, in general, even listening, I love pop music, and I do check out, all the latest hits and things like that. But I think the music that most resonates with me and with what I'm playing tends to be fairly abstract. And so his whole group, having backgrounds and having studied jazz, he was one of the artists that I was like, someday I really, really, really hope to work with him. Steve Coleman is another artist, a really incredible sax player, whose music, it always really excited me, and I was always blown away by the level of his compositions. And there was sort of this chaos that would align when I would hear him play and his band played together, that was like, you don't quite know what's going on at any point, and then all of a sudden they're all together. And I was always super interested in the more abstract avant-garde jazz. So I think when looking at who and the direction of these collaborations, I think it kind of made sense that those artists were as well as equally interested in the kind of classically trained but heading in that avant-garde direction. So Ambrose is someone who I ended up working with and I'm continuing to work with on albums, and later, just this past year, had the opportunity to work with Steve Coleman. And those were moments where I really felt that that it was just a language. It's like a whole separate language than anything you could ever study. It wasn't about who knew what those chords were or who had the best perfect technique. Like, those things almost just go out the window, and you're honestly just having this conversation. And the people who are the most open, Derek, as you had mentioned, if there's a jazz combo that is really rooted in traditional jazz improvising, they may not want to dance outside of that area. So I guess I was always exploring and interested in the artists who were wanting to dance and have that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I have found similarly like that as I've gotten older, my ears have gotten bigger or more open. And so what I used to listen to, listening to quartets, for instance, playing 80 choruses on rhythm changes or something like that, unless they're doing something really interesting and probably venturing outside of what the written chord changes are, I'm not really interested. So it's sort of along the same lines. I think as we mature, it kind of goes that way. Similarly, I always sort of have gotten my cues from what I've heard as well, from artists that have really inspired me. So I don't know how, my first one that I was really, really digging was Charles Mingus. And all of that is rooted kind of in the blues, but then he takes some significant detours, which are really sweet, like listening to the Epitaph record and listening to some of his later stuff is really just, it's rooted in jazz harmony, but the emotional component of it is so much higher. Coltrane's A Love Supreme, for instance, this guy that invented a lot of this bebop that we still do, you watch them as they get into their later period, if you will, sort of like classical composers, that it shifts. And I think that was always something that I gravitated to as well. Pat Metheny was another one, and I always was so intrigued with his sort of crossover vibe of a lot of it's really straight, a lot of it is pop based, but it's beautiful. And I can recall going to a Pat Metheny quartet concert where they had taken us to such a significant high musically that like I can remember I didn't have control over like my body. I was just losing my mind. It was so beautiful and so powerful. And it was like, how do we replicate that? Similarly to going to a Mahler concert, and listening to Mahler 6, it's a similar emotional reaction to me if performed well. So it was always funny. Derek, you asked the question, how do we relate back and forth? Well, classical euphonium on one side and jazz trombone on the other. And there are my classical friends saying, why are you going to a Pat Metheny concert? Who's Pat Metheny? And then the jazz people are saying, why do you care about Carl King marches? Why do you care about the Marine Band? So just kind of talk about those goofy stereotypes. It's been interesting to walk the middle. But as I've gotten, and I'm not that old yet, but as I've gotten older, we're watching more and more crossover actually. So in the wind band world, which is primarily where I live now as a conductor, the music is highly commercial music based, whether it's inspired by rock from the 80s or it's jazz from the 60s and 70s or even later. And so all of a sudden that music is familiar to me. And my students just kind of look at me and go, how do you know about this? You're a band director, And so that's been the coolest part, from a practical standpoint too. As I learned more and more harmony, whole tone, diminished whole tone, all that stuff later that went along with chord symbols, that stuff was showing up in my classical euphonium solos. And so all of a sudden, instead of this like really wonky fingering passage or something like that, it made sense because there was something to it. It was crossing over. And so I've done that a lot with my students. Like, what chord is this here? And they're like, I don't speak jazz. What do I care? Well, here's why it's important to know that. And then sort of along Gina's line too, it just sort of, I think we all kind of have hit this as improvisers. Like we do something really down the middle and then all of a sudden we veer off. I can remember getting hired to play in a quartet with my faculty, the faculty members during my undergrad. And they said, you don't need music. And I said, well, what tunes are we going to play? And they said, don't worry about it. And I said, how long is the gig? And they said, it's a 2-hour gig. And I said, listen, I don't know. I mean, you got to tell me what tunes so I can go study. They said, don't worry about it. And so we roll up and it was saxophone, bass, drums, and me on trombone. And they just started playing. And they said, figure it out. And it was like, you had to use your ears in a different way. And no longer was it about all of the harmony that I've been talking about for the last 30 minutes. Now it was just about what did the bass player say that the drummer could, and how can I, and all of a sudden you're thinking about chamber music just like we would in a classical quartet, but we're creating all that. I mean, so it's just, the crossover is immense. Yeah. And those gigs are the ones that I have the most fun with anymore, are a very loose framework and it can just blossom everywhere.
Well, and like just on my professor high horse over here, it's like, jazz and classical music are so intimately related throughout history. Whereas the music kind of evolved and then went over to Europe and was sort of co-opted by composers and music over in Europe that then in turn influenced the development of music back over the United States. And so it's like, it's so connected. And we think about like Debussy and Ravel, and we think about like their harmonic concept and roots. And then we see direct parallels with like John Lewis and Gil Evans, right, with the same types of structures. And it's like, and as someone who now considers, if I'm with jazz people, I'm the classical guy, and when I'm with classical people, I'm the jazz guy. And so as that kind of person, I have like a mental sickness now where I will hear music in other music constantly. And so, we'll be in the middle of Beethoven 7 and I'll just be like, that's rhythm changes,
Yeah, right.
At the end of the second movement of Beethoven 7, there's a ba 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 thing going on. And so, yeah, I think that they're super connected. And, Tim, you kind of steered us in another direction where it's like, how has improvisation and just sort of the improvisational thinking impacted and helped your abilities on the instrument in the classical sense? I think that's like another good thing to talk about, because when I met Gina, she and my wife were winning the concerto competition at NYU. And now, last year, Gina came out here and 5 minutes before her concert, she said, "Get your trumpet. We're gonna improvise."
Sweet.
Yeah, it's very true. How has improvising informed my classical playing? Well, it's interesting because, yes, I think about 10 years ago, I was very, again, rooted in classical music. When we had played that concerto, it was a Moscheles double flute concerto for, flute and oboe with a full orchestra. And that was actually, it was in 2012, and that was the year that I really began exploring improv much more so. But I think, um, you know, my sound on flute, I actually think it's harder for me to say how it's informed my classical playing, because I think oftentimes I'm not certain that um, it's done much to my classical playing, except I feel a lot more free when I'm on stage and playing classical music. I will say, I think it worked very much in the reverse, that when I began improvising, I began exploring how to mic my instrument, because in an improvised setting, flute is so quiet compared to most of the other more normal instruments like drums or saxophone or a brass instrument or a piano. And so what I was finding is that in improvised setting context, that my flute didn't cut through. And you will notice that most wind instruments or most improvisers are playing with a microphone. So I had to figure out how to solve that issue. So I got a pickup for my flute. And one of the other problems, and this is probably rooted in my classical background, is that I was used to playing in concert spaces that had great acoustics, such as churches or big concert halls that were built to support classical performances. And all of a sudden, I was placed in these performance settings that were dead spaces, and I wanted to figure out how to counter that with my instrument. And so I added a reverb pedal to my setup so that I could manually add reverb that I wanted to hear naturally because of my classical training. And that was 100% my interest in adding that reverb pedal into my setup, was to just counter the spaces I was playing in. Little did I know that I was going to love the sound of long reverb and use that as another jumping off point to be able to improvise over. Because if you add a effects pedal to your instrument, you have the ability now to take what would have been an acoustic sound and to stack yourself in many, many layers. And then I began exploring more pedals and wanting to add in more to my setup, and that opened up a whole new section of improvising for me. So I think it almost works like my classical training kind of led me in this very analog pedal setup by mistake again, because of me wanting to hear that sort of church, huge reverb, great, beautiful classical sound that I had kind of gotten accustomed to.
Yeah, I mean, except for the harmony version, jazz was terrible for my classical playing. It was awful for it. I mean, I got racked all the time, particularly when I was a kid. I mean, they were like, "You don't sound good. You're really bright. It's not. What are you doing?" And so that was the constant struggle for me, was being able to think about sound differently. So I mean, the brain knowledge definitely paid it backwards to classical, and vice versa. But the sound thing was, I mean, I just can remember getting hit over and over again. Boy, your classical sound, man, is too bright. What's wrong with you? That doesn't sound good. Like, ouch.
Yeah, Tim, you're totally right about that. I remember, like at Miami, I was doing cognate and classical performance, so I was doing basically both DMAs, and I would on purpose have my lessons back to back with Craig Morris and Brian Lynch, so
Yeah, there you
two
go.
of the top people in their fields, and so I would go I would go and meet with Craig, and we would play. And we would get to the point where he said, "Okay, that sounds right. That's the right sound." And I would say, "Okay, what is it? Describe the sound. Give me the adjectives." And I write them all down. And then I'd go to Brian, and we'd get to the point where he said the sound is right, and I say, "Tell me the adjectives." And the adjectives, were the same. They were saying the sound had the same qualities, and yet the sounds were totally different. And so, I think, and it was really eye-opening for me in that, it's like, you had to have a clear, precise, brilliant, crisp sound but that sounded different depending upon the context. And so, that helped me be able to, to spider off, spider on kind of thing. And, but, talking about classical playing too, it's like the first time I played Histoire du Soldat, Stravinsky, Soldier's Tale, and that, it's a crazy piece because it's like steady tempo, but changing meter instead of, and that compositional pathway. And everyone hates that piece because of it, because they're like, I don't know where the downbeat is. But me with my jazz background, I'm used to playing and feeling across the bar. And so it was like the first rehearsal was like, boom, this grooves.
No problem.
And they were like,
Yep.
huh. And so I was sitting there and go, okay, this is a place where my jazz, I played a piece with a wind ensemble last year that was very commercial. It was actually a wind ensemble and trumpet solo for the Japanese cartoon called Treasure Island, Takarajima. And it was hilarious, but it was like there's clave going the whole way through. And after the first rehearsal, I was like, all right, everyone, we're clapping clave. Taught the band clave, and then that thing grooved.
Yep.
And so, just different ways of thinking and hearing can help influence back and forth. And even like playing Maslanka's music and things like that. There's always like the 2 against 3 is not math, it's groove.
No. Yeah.
What? Just touching on that, Derek, I actually think, I wasn't thinking about it before, but I do think that having worked in the with improvisers, I began working with drummers, which was never something that when I was studying classical I ever worked with. Maybe we worked with percussion and orchestra, but it wasn't until I started working with drummers in improvised settings that my classical, my kind of traditional playing, my rhythm it was like a game. It was a huge game changer for me. And my time has just gotten so much better because of working with drummers. And I do not think that would have happened if it weren't for branching into improvisation, because most of the classical music that you study, especially on solo instruments like the flute, they don't have drum set written in there. They don't necessarily, they're not flute and percussion, not until you get into the contemporary music realm. Yeah. So I think that was one thing that did strengthen my classical playing much, much more.
I can remember like going into lessons and saying, play more musically, play more musically. And I was like, I'm doing what it says. What do you mean play more musically? Is it faster, slower, or louder, softer? That's what somebody actually equated musicianship to me one time. And I was like, he's not wrong. But I found listening to ballad playing really sort of influenced my classical playing. If there was one positive one, that would be it. Because the idea of freedom and space with written melody really came back, and all of a sudden it was like these solos that I had played before had new life, because I was thinking about where the tension and release was, and the fact that I can do whatever I want rhythmically if the pianist or the ensemble can follow me. And that really opened a lot of doors. And that's, in a way, I guess, improvising. I wasn't thinking about that, but just thinking of listening to Miles Davis play a ballad, for instance, you just go, he's not playing what the rhythm is, and if he did, it would be square and not cool. That really helped a lot.
Awesome. So, okay, now let's see. We have a little bit of time left, and let's say that we had a time machine, and you could go back and you could tell your, oh, I'm breaking my chair, and you could tell your freshman undergraduate self some tips. What would you say? I'll go first. What do you guys think? So if I was going to be able to go back, given what I've experienced now, I would say, dude, practice Clark Technical Studies, learn your scales, start doing single tongue on Arbin basic exercises, get your classical technique together, and do that in addition to everything that you're already doing. Because I wasted a lot of time in undergrad trying to bust my ass through etudes that I had no business playing because I didn't have the fundamentals, and then going to play jazz because that's what I was good at and I was getting fulfillment. So I would say work on classical trumpet fundamentals is what I would tell myself, and also practice harder on those 2-5-1s. Maybe I can get them done in a year instead of 2.
It's a good question. I think at that time I was playing the music that I was being told what to play. We have our teachers who are our mentors on our instrument, and they're so they're so helpful in helping us develop during those stages. But I'm not always so certain that I was learning music that I liked. And so I think, and something, you know, that I learned much later is that in order maybe to have more control over what you're playing, you might have to create that music yourself. And so I think that I had interest in so many types of music that was not what I was doing on my instrument, that I never thought that it would be the kind of music that I would be able to play someday. And I was always really aware of the fact that this sort of kind of perfect playing kind of got in my growth during that stages, because there's a lot of pressure to play kind of perfectly, or you know, you're constantly being told what you're not doing right, and that's all helpful information. So you know, I was continuing to grow, but I think you know, knowing that you can still have a very fulfilling career despite the fact that you might not feel like you are able to play perfectly or correctly, because you know, that's what you're constantly being told, I think is something that was something I had to let go of and be okay with saying, okay, I can't play that specific piece because it's so technically challenging. Maybe I never will. But at the time, there's just that if I can't do it, then I won't make it type mentality. And so I think for myself, I would go back and say, you know, be comfortable with knowing that you can create what you want to create if you can take it into your own hands.
Amen.
Man, that's really good. I don't have any of that. I probably would have told myself to play more piano. You know, I thinking of that question is really weird because I don't think I had a particularly successful upbringing in music, really. I just sort of got lucky as I hit different things. And I was so stupid that I just would kind of go wherever the wind blew me. And I guess I would have be smarter and be patient. I was never a patient individual. If I saw I had to go do that. I had to go do that now, yesterday, in fact. And so just be patient. I wish I would have learned things. I'm old enough now that it's really hard for me to learn big swaths of tunes or something like that. I wish I would have taken the time to understand how to learn things a little bit better versus just cramming through it. And then, play more piano. That one has always gotten me. If I wish I had played a rhythm instrument a little bit better. It's all right in front of your face.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, learn drum set.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
I tried. Oh, it's awful. I'm terrible at it. Yeah, so bad.
Man, I'll have to teach jazz techniques occasionally here, and I'm really pushing to have the curriculum be able to play a tune or two on bass, drums, and piano for everyone in the class.
Idea. Yeah,
you know?
I mean, just some facility on those instruments.
Because they're going to be band directors, right? So,
yeah. I mean, and it's amazing too, not to really go into the classical area, but the number of conductors that can't sit down and read a score on the piano. How can you hear the full sense of the harmony? And it goes all across the board that way, you know,
right.
Having facility or sit down and play drum set in a groove. I'm really jealous of drummers. I wish I could do that.
I can totally relate to that. I mean, all through music theory, you know, it was play it for me, and I'll tell you exactly what it is. But looking at it and having to do the math, I hated that. Okay, next up, let's see. If you were to give me 3 artists that people probably don't know about that you think they should listen to.
I'm gonna lose, so I'm gonna go first. I think Gina's gonna blow me away, so I'm gonna go first.
Okay. Oh, wait, hold on. I gotta write this down. Let me pull up a thing here. All right, go for it.
So Hamilton D. Hollanda is one. He's a mandolinist, and it is ridiculous music, unbelievably virtuosic, but also beautiful. He's from, I think he's from Paraguay, but I can't remember. But I think he's from South America. He's a beautiful player. The Brian Blade Fellowship, that particular band, actually, Brian Blade's a very, very well-known jazz drummer, but this group that he put together, they have 2 records out. And I would be shocked if most of it wasn't written down. And yet the sounds that they achieve together are really, really cool. And then the other one is a group that I really don't know that well, but I've been like jamming on lately is the Claudia Quintet.
Oh yeah.
And that just like blows everything out of the water. And I'm like, okay. Yeah, and Hollenbach, yeah. And so it's that kind of that idiom is really there's three that I'm thinking of right now.
Okay. All right, Gina, you're up.
Well, I will say, I don't know if people know them or not, but just two that have been wildly influential for my music making. One is Andy Akio. He is a composer and steel pianist. He has just written so much exciting and very rhythmically driven contemporary music. He often integrates improvisation. He features the steel pan a lot in his music, but he writes for all types of instrumentation. He's someone that I work with very closely and just feel very, very strongly about his musical vocabulary and what he's creating. As I mentioned before, Ambrose Akamusori, trumpet player, composer, just absolutely one of my favorite improvising artists and composers that I've ever heard. He's just has one of the most passionate dialogues throughout his music, and he's just a very musically conscious person in general. And I guess I want to say for electronic music, because I'm very, very, very into ambient electronic music, and I work with analog effects. One group that I feel just music resonates with me is a group called Boards of Canada. They are just a duo, and I don't know. I really like their electronic vibe.
Awesome. So if I'm going to add mine, I think that a group that not a whole lot of people probably know about. They're out of Austin, Texas, and they're called Progger, Progger, and they're like a cross between rock and roll and jazz, in a way. But the thing that's amazing about their music is how through composed it is, but it has tons of improvisation. And so it's like every single one of their tunes is more complex than a normal like jazz, song form. And it's epic. So I highly recommend Progger, and then Henry Threadgill is another favorite of mine. If people don't know about Too Much Sugar for a Dime, there are 3 tubas and 2 drum sets and 2 guitar players and French horn on that album, and so like the groove is just like that big, and and then I love Andy Milne. He's out in New York City, and his album New Age of Aquarius, where he's taken these like motifs. Like melodic, chordal, and rhythmic motifs that like the bass, the drums, and the piano are playing, and they're all totally different, but they line up. Your brain makes them line up, and it's just totally. I mean, I remember I took his ensemble when I was at NYU, and it was like he wouldn't tell us the key or the time or the meter or whatever, and taught us everything by ear. And it was this kind of thing where it was like everything was different, kind of like what Steve Coleman does in a lot of his music too. And in fact, I think that Andy and Steve have collaborated on stuff. So love that, and just the Phantom Fourth. People don't listen to enough Frank Zappa anymore, so love me some Frank Zappa.
Well, being out there, yeah, man.
Yeah. Well, so we're getting to our final minute here, and I wanted to thank both of you for taking the time to talk to me and talk to our viewers here. And for those who, I don't know if either of you have seen the end of any of our other broadcasts, but we have a signature sign-off that we do with everyone. And so we're going to have everyone go around and do your best impression of a mouth trumpet. And so, it might sound something like this. Okay. Okay, 5 out of 10. So thank you so much, Gina Izzo, Tim Shade. We've had a lovely time today, and we talked about a lot of crazy stuff, dropped a lot of bombs, and I'm sure we'll have some follow-up questions and things like that. But I wish you both well with the coming school semester, and stay safe. And this is Brass Institutes of Virginia signing off. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks so much, Derek. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much to Gina Izzo for coming on the show today with Derek and Tim so all could share their journeys with improvisation and how it has become a vehicle for collaboration and innovation. If you would like your product or school to be featured on our broadcasts, please reach out to me, Dakota Corbliss, Director of Operations, at dakota@fredbrass.com, and we'll be sure to set it up. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.